that there's evidence that we do not have a slow wireless network connection in this room. Therefore, please limit yourselves to one active computer, tablet, or phone that is connected to the wireless network. I don't know what the evidence is, but trust me. Lunch today will be again in the Vevey room on the second floor. New posters will be presented today at 2:30, also on the second floor. And please visit the posters at that time. And also, the abstracts are now available online at the Peer Review Congress website. So, that much for housekeeping. It's a great pleasure to have Harlan Krumholz today with us to give the keynote for this morning. Now, you know Harlan. Who is Harlan? So, this morning I decided to use this very trustworthy software called Publish or Perish, very fitting for the conference. And so Krumholz H index 176, citations 132,670, including 12,593 for last year. G index 314, HI norm 79, I10 741. This is Harlan in the 21st century. And obviously, Harlan is also many, many other things. He has many appointments as a professor of medicine, professor of investigative medicine, professor of public health, professor at the Institute for Social and Policy Studies, director for the Center for Outcomes Research and Evaluation, co-director of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Clinical Scholars Program, and many, many, many more at Yale University. And he's one of the major thinkers about where we're heading with openness and transparency and what the new world will be like. So the new world may include preprints and other threats to traditional publishing. And this is the topic of his talk. Harlan.
Very nice. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be at a conference that's dedicated to improving the scientific research enterprise, a group who's willing to look inward and be critical and think about how we can improve over time. I will tell you, I'm humbled by the numbers. My work, of course, has been done with so many collaborators, but I will say to Peer Review Congress, our aim is not publication. Our aim is scholarship for impact. And what we need is good, thorough, rigorous peer review in order to help us make that impact, in order to vet our work, to help us disseminate it in credible and important ways. And so I see us all in partnership around that. But I want to say that for us, it's never about the paper. It's always about the work that can be done, the impact that can be had, the lives that can be improved. It's the field that we're in. The topic today I have is preprints. Actually, Drummond gave me this talk that included this tale about threats to the research enterprise. Let's start with a disclosure slide. And I'll say that after 8 years of editing a journal, one of the circulation journals, I wrote this. I refer you to this editorial, The End of Journals, as a reflection on some of my concerns about what were some of the threats. And it wasn't the threats as much to the research enterprise, and I will say this was a self-reflective piece. It was about my own experience. But it was an opportunity for me to identify where I thought we needed to improve as I was leaving my editorship. And I would rather not spend my talk talking so much about these threats as about, I think, an opportunity that has presented itself, and to think together with you about it. It's about preprints, and I beg the indulgence of the people here from more basic sciences who are so familiar with the idea of preprints. But let me tell you that within clinical medicine, this is a very foreign concept that brings trepidation to many people. So for those of you who don't know, what are preprints? Well, scientists produce a product. And let me say the notion of the word preprint may even be a misnomer, because this is just one use case as a predecessor to what will ultimately become a publication in a peer-reviewed journal. There are other use cases as well, but for the moment, let's call them preprints. So a product is produced and it can be submitted to a journal, subjected to peer review, with the aspiration of being able to be published in one of your illustrious journals. But it could also be such that someone wants to share it immediately with their scientific community. And so they will prefer to be able to do that pre-peer review. They know their colleagues are capable of understanding issues in their field. They're actually capable of doing their own peer review. And the notion of being able to circulate that information immediately becomes preeminent in their thoughts because they want to be able to work within their community. And they may also want their community to be able to provide them feedback in real time now, not just to wait through the cycles of peer review or through rejection and resubmission in order to finally get it out there and let the world see it. But they prefer to be able to be part of that community now, move quickly, accelerate the progress. And so this is really what preprints are. This goes up to the server and then can be distributed. It may also then ultimately or at the same time be submitted for peer review. There's lots of different ways it can happen, but the notion is that we can archive, memorialize, put into place our product, some product of our work that we wish to share, and have it be archived in a way that it can be citable and enduring on the internet so that we can trust that it'll be there, others can see it. So I just want to thank the organizers, particularly Annette and Drummond, for indulging me in a discussion of non-peer review in a peer review Congress, because obviously the focus here is about how to improve peer review, but I suggest that your scope be broader, because I really believe your mission is to improve the scientific enterprise broadly, and just as my mission is to have impact, I believe yours is too. That in the end you want to see the products of your own work improve the world, not just lead to more and higher impact factors and more accolades for your journals, but actually to see the world better as a result. I do want to say first, and this is obsequious, thank you all for accepting my papers. I can't, please continue. This isn't an attempt to undermine peer review, this notion of preprints. I don't think of it as a substitution. And I will say, and I've probably every editor who's worked with me knows my feeling about this. Every journal has improved our work. Our publication is, I can't remember a time when, and I would have appreciated at least one time, where you would have written us and said, this is such a beautiful paper, actually we don't think you need to touch it at all. I'm hoping, John, that happens before I'm done, but when we reflect on the comments we get, I'll tell you the truth, we don't agree with all of them, but we know in our hearts by the time we're done that this vetting does improve our work. So thank you, and it plays an important role. So look, peer review matters. I just, in case you were feeling a little insecure, peer review matters, and so there's no question about that. The issue is, where's the role of preprints? And I just ask you to keep an open mind, because at least within clinical medicine, there reside a reservoir of strong feelings about whether or not it's appropriate for people to be sharing results in advance of vetting by peer review. And for one thing, in the clinical medicine, we are often publishing for non-experts. So in many journals, especially particularly as you get down to specialty, you're publishing for experts in your field. Your readership is circumscribed. The products are intended for a group of people who are working in the field for them to continue to advance. Now, they may hand that off to someone else. They may hand it off. It may become something a company uses, or it may become something that a drug company brings further and disseminates or something as a new drug or device or so forth. Or it just may be knowledge for knowledge's sake that's important. But in clinical medicine, our journals have actually a dual audience. It's for the people working in the field, but it's also for the broader audience of people practicing. And that's what I think leads in part to the strong feelings and the sense of trepidation that can accompany this issue. So what problem are we trying to solve with preprints? What problem is it? Because I think it's important to hone in on this. And I say it's, how do we easily and rapidly archive and share information with other scientists to accelerate research, enhance collaboration, reduce waste, and increase transparency? And notice I say, I'm going to get back to this, with other scientists, in order to help us move faster and be more open and to share, create collaborative culture. That's the question, whether this would be, can we improve on that? And again, you know, in my view, these servers are complementary to and not a replacement of peer review. So I think we need to be thinking about whether this augmentation of our current ecosystem would be of some advantage within even clinical medical research. Now, for those of you who don't know, the idea here is about the enduring site. A lot of things do get posted in different places, but you never know if they're going to stay. Even when we cite them in our articles, if we put a URL, we have to put the date that we did it, but it doesn't mean that you'll ever be able to find it again. And so, this DOI, the digital object identifier, becomes very important. This unique alphanumeric string assigned by registration agency to identify content and provide a persistent link to its location on the internet. I mean, this is the idea. Memorialize, anchor, allow it to be findable and usable by others in ways that might not be possible otherwise. Now, I bring up this issue of science for scientists. I will tell you, as someone who does clinical research and health services research, and I'm using preprint servers all the time. Why? Because some of my work is in economics. I mean, I can't remember reading an economics journal, but I get MBR preprints all the time. People are circulating. As our group tacked towards artificial intelligence and machine learning, I realized that we are wholly dependent on preprint servers for our information. If we wait for peer review publication, we'll be years behind in the field. And in that field, they're sharing code. It's a remarkably collaborative. I believe that the peer review still provides benefit for them, but the truth is, if you want to move and be collaborative within that field, every day we're passing around preprints. Now, because we're passing it around to our group, they actually don't have to be exactly right. They're teaching us what other people are thinking. They're sharing what other people are doing. Other people are able to anchor the provenance of the idea and how it's related to their work and when. So safely they're saying, we're doing this. But it allows us to keep going, to be current, to be at the vanguard, and to understand what's happening. And it makes us want to share also. It transforms the way we think about these things. So the notion is really science for scientists. Now, pre-peer review results are already released, and believe it or not, major journals already allow peer review release of information. All of them do. All of them do. But for some reason, there's a dissonance between what they're doing now and this notion of being able to allow people to systematically post their stuff in comprehensive ways. So how are they doing it? Well, medical meetings. By the way, I go to medical meetings. There are abstracts, one-page posters, and in my medical meetings, the PR machine is promoting them to the press. They're pushing them out. This isn't about, somebody's just talking to scientists. At our meetings, they're making them as public as possible. They can be front-page headlines. Clinicaltrials.gov is a preprint of sorts, a results reporting. Press releases. When the Sprint trial was done, NHLBI ran a press conference to give the results in advance of the publication, but you couldn't search the information about what was going on. And these press releases are also coming out for SEC. Cantos, the big trial at the European Society of Cardiology, 2 articles, one article in Lancet, one article in New England Journal of Medicine. We knew the results several months ago because of press releases. But the problem is that the information's often incomplete. It may not be citable, often isn't. You're using a URL that may be there temporarily, and it's not searchable. So it's sort of this information's getting out in very incomplete ways. So I am suggesting there's a use case for people when they submit, but I'm also suggesting that to resist it is to say, well, why are we doing this? I mean, we're encouraging meetings, abstracts, presentations like this. I can present something here and no one will bat an eye if I put this in for publications, if I presented some data. But on a preprint server, it's shocking that somebody would actually make it look like a paper, because that's concerning. And so, we have to really think about this use case of saying we really don't want to, we want to be able to share even the preliminary piece, even though we know it will evolve. And then the way it's currently being done, there's no opportunity for community comments or dialogue. It's not systematically positioned for feedback, growth, and insight, and so forth. Now, Improve It trial is an example of this. This is an important trial of ezetimibe that had been running for many years and was long anticipated. The results were released. The press release went out August 2014. In November of 2014, it was presented in full form at the American Heart Association, but it wasn't published until June 2015. In the interim between that press release and then the full presentation of the American Heart Association, you couldn't really say, well, I really want to review what was even presented. I mean, you could find URLs on the web, but it was not really archived, memorialized. I can't tell you today that you could find it. If you wanted to understand what the difference was between the public presentation in November and what was ultimately published, you might have difficulty. And yet, this might be important information also to see that evolution. This is about just full transparency of our evolution of discussion in science. There also, as a second use case, there are lack of options for less publishable products. So protocols and technical reports. Sure, some of them are getting published in journals, but many of them don't. From the moment a study goes live, wouldn't it be great to have a detailed protocol posted, citable, searchable, understandable? When I do a study that's 2 degrees different than that study, I can build on it rather than not even knowing it really exists, except that in clinicaltrials.gov it's registered. Quality innovations. We're moving rapidly to try to improve quality. People within a single institution may be doing something they want to share, almost like case reports, but it may take too long by the time they go through the process of publishing, and maybe they want other people to build on it so that higher grade science can evolve from it. But there's no place to put it now. White papers, government reports, a whole range of other things that might be useful. And then unpublished trial data. You know this is a scandal. Many trials are never reported or delayed by years. These are experiments on human beings that are being performed, and no one's ever being told the result. I think the entire medical literature is corrupted by publication bias, and thank goodness for the clinical trial registry, but still, in observational studies, it's a free-for-all. In clinical trials, we're still not finding out the results. In a paper we published in BMJ, only 29% of completed clinical trials conducted by faculty at major academic centers were published within 2 years of completion. And only 13% were reported on clinicaltrials.gov. When I ask some people, they say, believe it or not, it's too much trouble to publish. What we need is at least for people to be able to post their results on clinicaltrials.gov and to provide more context and in an archive that's memorialized as a complement to it so that we can be able to get all of this out. And then there's speed. Look, it's not just all about speed, and peer review should be deliberate. It should be thorough, rigorous. We depend on peer review to give us an assessment of and improve the science. So this isn't merely about saying, well, we just need to move so fast on everything. There's times when deliberation is needed. And so, on the other hand, delay isn't inherently good just for itself. So one of the things I want to say, and I'm going to show just a little data from BMJ Open. I want to say Trish Groves does a great job on BMJ Open. It's a great home for protocol papers. We've published there before, and they've made them better. But in the course of the evaluation of those papers at BMJ Open, it may be that we should have posted, and by the way, BMJ would have allowed that. I didn't even realize it at the time. But we looked at the time from protocol papers being submitted to BMJ Open to their publication, and the median time was about 5 months. You know, when you get peer reviewers, they do help us on these papers because they tell us to clarify or add more information. But, you know, sometimes they say, you know, you really shouldn't enroll those patients, so you really should do this. You're saying you're in the field. I mean, we should, this is something, a lot of this information could have been posted because it will never change because you're describing something you're already doing. And so the question sort of is, can preprints complement this? Still, the publication and peer review is useful, but I believe so would be rapid publication. So what are some of the concerns that we've heard about this for clinical medicine? Well, there's already too much fake information out there. You're just going to be putting up more. This is a report from that journal, predatory journal, the National Enquirer, about I'm back from the dead, that Rita Hayworth. But look, this is, people can go on the internet, they can Google, there is a lot of noise in the environment. I think a fear that this just augments that is misplaced in the sense of where we are today. It is true, people have told me there's already too much information. Why would you want to make more information? Well, I mean, that's an argument against so many journals too. I mean, the point is that it's not the information overload, it's the filter failure. And we've got to be good about figuring out what's worth it, what's not. It's not about us restricting or censoring. It's about us creating opportunities for worthy contributions to be available and then for us to be able to build the filters that do it. There's a concern that the public may act prematurely and harm may accrue. What if somebody posts something about the benefits of arsenic for this or that, or someone's doing something irresponsible where they're promoting something that could be harmful. Well, I think this needs to be framed as science for scientists. And I'll talk a little bit about mitigation strategies, but the preliminary nature of this, the notion that this isn't yet peer-reviewed, needs to be prominent in all of this, and we need to be able to implement that. You may say, well, people will ignore it. Well, believe me, there's a lot of stuff on the internet that people don't ignore. You just have to do the best you can. I don't believe that this is something that can't be managed. There's also a concern that we may undermine clinicaltrials.gov. This isn't meant to replace it either. The results reporting is something we should all be pushing for clinical trials. But as Deb Zarin herself will say, it's about results reporting. But there's a lot more to being able to provide context and meaning to those results, even in the preliminary stage, that can complement the results reporting within it. And so we have to be careful not to be a substitute for it, but to be a strengthening, a link to it that can make it better. So what are some of these risk mitigation strategies? Well, the idea of having high-level screens to be sure that common levels of decency are being adhered to, that there isn't anything that seems obviously dangerous or inappropriate. Ensuring that what's being posted is IRB approved or exempted. To require posting of clinical trials also on clinicaltrials.gov to say what we're looking for to strengthen that institution too, if you want to use ours for that purpose. I heard this today from Brooks Hansen, the idea that corresponding authors should be ORCID connected so that there is it's not a troll, a fake individual. Not that still that couldn't occur, but that's also incorporated in. And then labeling and watermarks on everything that's done that notes the preliminary nature, the lack of peer review, the idea that this isn't a substitute for a finished product, but in fact it is something that seeks to be shared. So a major concern by my colleagues is, will this jeopardize peer review publication? Even though meetings and press releases, clinicaltrials.gov, do not obviate, the journals seemingly do not pay attention to that, do not consider that pre-publication, there is this concern that when you put it on a preprint server, so it's memorialized in archive, as long as we put it somewhere where it's hard for people to find or may never exist for a long period of time, even though it's out there, that's okay. But if you actually anchor it and archive it and are transparent about it, ooh, that's a problem. Because, well, I don't know why, but that's the way it is. So, we looked, and actually there's a Wikipedia page that says what journals allow preprints. And there's a lot of green there, but not a lot necessarily in clinical medicine. I was very happy to see this from the BMJ, and I think it's worthy of note. BMJ did have a preprint server, by the way, in 1990s, I believe. And so it says preprint can be posted. I emailed Fiona Godley, and she confirmed that that's not a problem. And even I'm saying about BMJ Open, I don't know why we never posted to a preprint, why we had submitted. We should have. We looked here at Nature. I like this. The policy states, neither conference presentations nor posting on recognized preprint servers constitute prior publication. Nature never wishes to stand in the way of communication between researchers. Communication between researchers includes not only conferences, but also preprint server. The archive preprint server is the medium of choice for physicists and astronomers, blah, blah, blah. If scientists wish to display drafts of research papers on established preprint servers before or during submission to Nature or any journal, that's fine by us. And I say kudos to Nature. Now I realize that many of you may be thinking they don't have some of the challenges of clinical medicine, but there are clinically relevant contributions that appear in Nature journals. So this idea of preprints, just to kind of close up here, is that it does provide for immediate access. And I've taken this and the other one that I showed from an ASAP Bio, of which I'm on the board, which is promoting preprint servers within the life sciences. And they have a nice video on YouTube that sort of explains this. But accelerate scientific progress, enable people to archive and do provenance of their work, to disseminate and show the priority. Let me just say NIH is now encouraging the use of preprints and is fully on board with this within the grant applications, others as well. Cancer Research UK encourages the use of preprints. Growing use in biology. BioRxiv is an amazing success story. People had a lot of doubts about it, but now it's receiving a tremendous number of submissions serving the community. And the green here is what the BioRxiv part about, the growth in preprints. And when Paul Ginsburg began this idea in physics, I think, it was remarkable how quickly that entire field began to sort of transform the way in which they were sharing. bioRxiv and others are showing how that can occur in the life sciences. So when's the right time for clinical medicine to do this? When's the right time for us to move forward and create this capacity? And I will say bioRxiv does have the ability for clinical trials, but it's never really taken off. It's been understood as a life sciences server. Clinical medicine has its own sort of peculiarities, issues. We have our own community. And so when's the right time? And I think, we at YODA, the Yale Open Data Access Group, I run with Joe Ross and assisted by Carrie Gross and Richard Lehman and others. When we were thinking about sharing data, there was this same question was posed. When's the right time? A lot of naysayers, people said, you'll never be able to get anyone to share individual patient-level data, much less companies. You're crazy. It's not worth the effort. You guys are wasting your time. Well, we're just not smart enough to stop, so we just keep going. And it turned out that there were people who wanted to be part of that, and it began as a catalyst for the field, and we believe it helped to spread, and many other people with really honorable and virtuous efforts were able to push that forward. We think now's the time for a preprint server in medicine, and we want to be committed to actually launching this. So, and I will tell you that the original plan was to announce and make it live today at this meeting. In discussions with others, we've come to believe that we should pause a little bit, not long, but to really see whether or not we can bring the field together and to talk a little more deeply with journals, with our community, with others, bioRxiv. We've been in discussions with bioRxiv. Can we align efforts? We do not want a competitive landscape where there are 15 or even, honestly, maybe even 2. It's just not necessary. Can we combine as a community? Can we align? Can we understand what the values are? Can we create these risk mitigation strategies that will be wise? And can we take steps that will, in fact, strengthen the clinical enterprise? I think we sort of say the idea here is to build a community resource. By the way, it's not that YODA will own it. We're stewards of it, not owners. We want to be able to help. Someone else may take it over at some point. The point is that we're trying to strengthen the community resource and iteratively learn. We need to evaluate at every turn so we can get stronger. Just as you're trying to get stronger in peer review, we want to be of you, and we want to be of the community, and we want to learn together about how this can be good. We want to make sure that we're not doing anything that's causing any harm. What's the goal? The goal is not to establish a server. No, it's about the impact. It's not about the process step. Of course, that has to be done extraordinarily well. But the goal is to improve and accelerate science, promote collaboration, enhance transparency, and reduce waste. Allow our communities to grow so we're fighting disease, not each other. Great, there always will be some inherent competition in science, but let the competition be on ideas and execution. But let us share. Let us share and let us be able to establish provenance from the moment. Let us improve over time. The ask for journals is to consider to allow the coexistence of preprint servers and not penalize scientists who use them. And I ask, is there really a difference from presenting at a meeting to posting at a preprint server, which is actually more transparent and something that's going to endure so people can see it and evaluate it for themselves. I invite you to tell us what you think. We've set up this email for the moment, medarchive@yale.edu. Everything's on the table about how to do this well. We would love to do this as a larger community. Again, we see ourselves as stewards, not owners or directors, and we would like to work collaboratively with anyone who wants to work collaboratively with us. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Harlan. I think we have some time for questions.
Hi there, Sharon Quimby from the American Academy of Neurology. Fabulous talk. It occurs to me that when a journal, and you've been an editor, when a journal goes to try to select external peer reviewers for a paper, do you think it will be more difficult for them to find folks who've not already had their eyes on this paper?
And you think because they've had eyes on this paper, that's a problem because?
Would you consider that a conflict as an editor?
No.
You wouldn't, okay.
Look, I think if someone has some relationship with the authors, if they've got some reason to be biased, but if someone is aware of the paper and has, I mean, my hope is that we create a means by which there's actually post-posting peer review that's also occurring, that people are making comments on the paper, and because someone is aware of it, I think they may be better positioned to comment on it. But it wouldn't preclude that, from my perspective. I don't know if others want to comment.
I'd be interested to hear what other editors think. I would think at least that would go in the comments to editor, just so that the editor could weight it appropriately depending on what their
And you think that conflict is?
You know, I just know, I'm a managing editor of a journal, and I've seen editor comments where somebody will write in and say, I've reviewed this paper for another journal, and some editors are fine with that, and they say, you know, we'd love to know whether the authors actually made changes relative to your original suggestions, and some editors want fresh eyes on that paper. So I think there's probably dueling philosophies out there.
Yeah, I wouldn't want someone who's decided how they feel about the paper. I wouldn't want someone who, that's true. Yeah.
Steve?
Hi, Steve Goodman,
Steve.
Stanford. So I'm going to say something in public I've said in private, but it's, I think, valuable to put out in the public conversation. And you've covered a lot of the territory. I really appreciate you sort of giving due to both sides. But you use as a touchstone the announcement at meetings. And then you talk about mitigation strategies. One could argue that the very structure and the sociology of meetings represent that mitigation strategy, and that it is difficult to find them, and that it is mainly a conversation among scientists. And the few things that break out, maybe sometimes there's a service in breaking out, and sometimes it actually does harm, because we see over and over, and we know well how preliminary those results are and how they change. Almost every study of abstracts shows that they either don't go on to publication, which is, as you say, sort of a crime, or that the data often change a lot. And the Sprint announcement of the press release was an example of something that probably shouldn't have occurred like that. So I guess what I would, and I'm sure right now we can't imagine all the positive changes and fully all the negative changes. I wonder, I think that this needs to be, I think there are lots of possibilities here, and I also think there are harms perhaps exaggerated by those who are comfortable with the current system. But it seems to me that as you roll this out, and I do think it's inevitable that it will be rolled out in some way, that you do it in a way, in a careful way, maybe in a narrow way, so we can begin to understand the positives and the negatives. Choose one field. Start small, figure out what you're going to monitor, make it a protocol, just like we would any therapeutic, and monitor the harms and the benefits. And then as we get more experience with it, we'll know exactly how to do these things. I am worried about many of the things you have very clearly rolled out there, and I don't know that meeting presentations are necessarily the model, or as we imagine them.
And I'll just say, at least in my field, those meetings, presentations get echoed and echoed and echoed in throwaway journal, they're not journals, throwaway things that we get all the time and in press and so forth. And this is, the argument back is just saying, why not just archive what was said so that anyone can say, well, actually what was said at that meeting, so that we could see. But fair enough, good points. I want to thank you, Steve.
George?
George Lundberg from Stanford. Congratulate Dr. Krumholz on a wonderful talk. I'd like to call the attention of the group to 3 other initiatives that are really quite related. One I mentioned 2 days ago called Curious, C-U-R-E-U-S, a medical journal on a platform in Palo Alto and San Francisco, which emphasizes post-publication peer review. Post-publication peer review has always been the most important form of peer review, because all the readers see it and they ignore it or they act on it. So I have to disclose there I have options in Curious. Second is Cancer Commons in Los Altos, cancercommons.org, a not-for-profit intended to share information about cancer between doctors, patients, industry, everybody freely. Marty Tenenbaum and I founded that in 2011. They pay me an honorarium. The third is Rapid Science in Brooklyn, New York. It's Sarah Green, who was once at Cancer Commons and moved back to Brooklyn, does rapid science, intended to do very, very much the same thing you're dealing with here, particularly in molecular medicine. 3 initiatives: Rapid Science, Cancer Commons, and Curious. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Katrina McCallum from Hindawi. I have one question and one comment. So the question is, to what extent do you think data should be shared when preprints are published? And the comment is in relation to conflicts of interest for editors and journals if you have a preprint. So this is based on my own experience, and I and others in this room, actually, including editors from Science and Nature, published a preprint. And we got a lot of feedback, independent feedback on that preprint. We also sought input from key experts in the field. And we revised it and then made the peer review comments public. And the altmetric score is within, I think it's in their top 5% of all papers. So I think, and I was a professional editor for 18 years, it was one of the best review experiences I've ever had. It improved the paper. And I think there is also an incentive for people to comment on papers before they go through a formal publication in a way that doesn't happen at post-publication when the article is sort of done and dusted, because they have a chance to influence the paper. So I think there's a whole range of benefits that come from posting preprints, as you outlined in your talk. And one is including expanding the peer review process.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this notion of sharing data is interesting. I think it should always be optional. I just will relate one story that someone told me about putting something up on a preprint server with their data, being contacted about an error in the code, and actually being in a suggestion about how to improve the analysis. It again led to this idea that when they did submit for public, they didn't simultaneously submit. When they submitted for publication, the paper had been substantially improved. That may be just an anecdote that doesn't generalize, but anyway, I think it's interesting for us to see how it fosters a community sense.
Two more short questions, Howard.
Thanks, John. Howard Bachner, JAMA and the JAMA Network. So a couple comments, Harlan, and then a question or two. Firstly, I would say this is being constantly debated. At our editorial board meeting in May, we spent 2 hours on it. And there were very strong opinions on both sides about allowing preprint servers, both by the JAMA editorial board as well as the 11 editors-in-chief of the JAMA Network journals. And for us, it's in transition. And so we're still considering what our ultimate decision will be. I suspect we will consider papers that have been posted on preprint servers, but discourage it. But that's still in transition. But I had one other comment and a question. The first, in your description of the benefits, the one thing that I was surprised that you left out is whether any of this will improve patient health. And to me, that's ultimately the goal for clinical and lab-based scientists and journal editors. Measuring it is very difficult. But I don't think it's around the speed of publication. I think the real goal is, do you improve patient outcomes? And you didn't mention that, and I was surprised by its absence. And the second is, and you alluded to this, is that many of the outcomes that JAMA and network journals, many of the outcomes of the trials we see change 180 degrees after peer review. Change really substantially. And these are reasonable scientists. I'm not concerned about kind of the fringe individual who would post on a preprint server. These are good scientists who our peer reviewers have pointed out they simply did the incorrect analysis or an inaccurate analysis, or take a quaternary outcome and make it the primary outcome. And so I do think the mitigation strategies, if this will be successful in clinical medicine, is critically important. It would be helpful to ensure that we don't do harm. And I know it always feels better if we're more transparent, if there's more science, if there's more information out there. But I think we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years, there is the real capacity to do harm. And so I do think a mitigation strategy will be critically important. When I've spoken to the bioRxiv folks, I've been surprised that they actually pre-review medical preprints to see if they should be posted. And there are exceptions when they are concerned from legitimate scientists that they don't post them.
So quick answers. The last one, bioRxiv, we worked with them around this clinical trial screening. It's not a review. It's a high-level evaluation, sees this a science paper, and then does it have anything that seems to offend. So they actually don't do a thorough review. I thought it was implicit in my talk that what I care about is impact. And I can tell you my own, I don't want to be randomized, but my own experience, the use of preprint servers is fundamentally making us a better research group. Knowing what's going on in economics and not having to wait for 2 years to see what's coming out. When Jonathan Gruber writes something, I can read it, understand it. What is it? Should it affect what we're doing? Same thing within machine learning and AI. We can see what's going on. We can do our own peer review. We can understand whether or not it's relevant or not to us. And that's this idea of science for scientists. It's about staying within the scientific community. The issue is going to be, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think for people who can't tell the difference between whether it's valid or not, then yeah, the peer review plays a very critical role. And for those of us still, I'd like to see it when it goes through peer review. But it also is of some use to me to see what people are thinking. It would make us more efficient. How you even study whether journals are improving patient outcomes can be very difficult to do. So, you know, the question is, within an observational ecosystem, what do we do to be able to evaluate our own impact? But let me say, point well taken about the harm, about the pressure we need to put on ourselves to evaluate and to be able to do this wisely. Points entirely well taken.
Thanks.
Last question from Deb, and I'm sure that this is a topic that will be discussed for months and ages.
Thanks. Deborah Zarin from clinicaltrials.gov. Harlan, that was a great talk, and I appreciate the support of clinicaltrials.gov. I'll just say two things. One is that I think your support is not just because you want to support it, but because we, in fact, impose reporting standards so that we hold people accountable to their pre-specified protocol and require that they fully report the outcomes, so it avoids the kind of cherry picking and other distortions that have been documented in abstracts and other things. But, excuse me, the second thing is that I'm wondering, one of the things that people frequently want us to be able to do, and we can't as the government essentially, is have a way to have comments going on about the results. And I'm wondering if there's any role for that in your server to have an ability for scientists, if you will, to communicate, to comment, and comment back, that kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you very much. And absolutely, I mean, the notion of what you're providing means it's sort of it's a quality check on what they're doing. And I believe this platform for interaction is a critical feature, a functionality of whatever it is we stand up, because in the essence, we're trying to foster a sense of community, ability to go back and forth and to learn from each other. And it's going to be critical that there is that function. And well, let's see if it grabs, if people find it useful, but it has to be there. Thank you.
Great. Perfect. Thank you, Harlan. And I think we should move to the next session.
Great. I'm Fiona Godley, Editor-in-Chief of the BMJ. A wonderful presentation, and thanks, Harlan. Great discussion. It has, however, put us behind time. So with permission from someone in the room, Annette, I propose to carry on the session, in fairness to these four presenters, till 10 o'clock. I hope that's all right with everyone. So, innovations. We've just had a fantastic example of where the future may be, and we've got four great presentations this morning about innovations in peer review, and the first to come up is Simon Harris.
Thanks, Fiona. So yes, I'm going to talk to you today about a study we've been carrying out at IOP Publishing to assess author demand for double-blind peer review on some of our journals. So me and my co-authors all work for IOP Publishing, that's the Institute of Physics Publishing, which is based in the UK. I'm a managing editor there. And the impetus for this study really came from a debate about the future of peer review, which we had at an IOP Publishing conference last summer. I guess some of you might be wondering, what's the big deal about another study about demand for double-blind? It has been done before. So I guess at the start I want to emphasize that though double-blind review may be quite common in some areas, in some disciplines, perhaps in some biomedical areas, it's really not at all common in physics. So single blind is very much the norm in physics and related disciplines, but we received feedback from some of our communities in support of double-blind, especially in the biophysics area. And this has prompted us to consider offering double-blind as an option on some of our journals to sort of assess the demand. We looked to do it on our Express journals, Materials Research Express and Biomedical Physics and Engineering, because they're relatively inclusive and international in their authorship. And some of the feedback we had was very much that there could be more demand for this option from authors from certain parts of the world who feel that double-blind is a fairer option. I'd like to acknowledge at the outset that, of course, Nature have done some really pioneering studies of author demand for double-blind, and I think we heard a really interesting presentation on Sunday from them about their studies. I'd like to think that this work complements what Nature have done. We're looking to some extent at some different subject areas, and also we have some different measures in place. I hope you can guess what these images are meant to represent. It's not meant to be some kind of hostage situation or a blind date or anything like that. No. So the main goals of this study, the main goal really is to assess author demand for double-blind review in the subject areas of material science and biomedical physics and engineering. And specifically, we want to assess author preference by offering authors a choice of whether to submit double-blind or single-blind, and then measure the level of uptake, which is the percentage of direct submissions that are double-blind. We're also looking at the geographical trends, we'll get onto that in a minute, and we want to assess authors' perception of double-blind review and how satisfied they were with the double-blind process, and we've done that through an author survey. Finally, we've collected data to compare operational aspects of the peer review process between single-blind and double-blind. So we've got a referee survey set up. We've also looked at peer review times for each model and how it works for the journal staff. So in terms of the study design, we decided to go with a one-year pilot study for double-blind on those Express journals. I should stress that it's a pilot study. We wanted to collect some data and then make a sort of informed decision about whether to continue with double-blind or indeed whether to roll it out onto some of our other journals. And the way we went about setting this up was to set up a second submission and peer review site for each journal, so a double-blind site to go with the single-blind one. The reason we did it that way is I think it works more easily for reporting purposes to have the two sites. And if it turned out that there wasn't much demand for double-blind, it's easier to roll back to just offering single-blind. We put the onus on authors. Sorry, the authors are able to choose, obviously, whether to submit single-blind or double-blind. We very much put the onus on authors to anonymize their papers and gave them some guidelines for doing that. Although, as I think we heard yesterday, a lot of them don't seem to take much notice of guidelines. I think we all know that. So the one-year pilot was launched back in January, following sort of promotion for a month or two to the relevant communities. So this is what authors see when they come to submit to either of these journals. We point out to them that there's now a double-blind option on the journal, and that they're responsible, if they choose that, they're responsible for anonymizing their manuscript, and it points them to a checklist to help them do that. And then they've got the choice, they can click on either of those tabs, and it takes them to the relevant Scholar One site. So we've done an analysis of the data 7 months in, specifically for this conference, so I should stress that these are kind of interim findings at this stage. The final analysis will be done after 12 months. The primary measure for us is the proportion of direct submissions to each journal that are submitted for double-blind review. And we set a significant uptake threshold at the start of the study, which was 10% double-blind uptake for MRX and 20% for BPEX. We thought the demand might be higher because it's in a biophysics area. We put surveys together at the final decision stage for submitting authors to measure satisfaction levels out of 10 with the double-blind process. And we also asked double-blind authors why they chose that option rather than single-blind. So on to the results. And in fact, the uptake on MRX, the Materials Journal, has been much higher than we expected. Just over 20% of direct submissions this year have been down the double-blind route. That's over 200 submissions to that journal. For BPEX, it's exactly 20% uptake, which is what we predicted. It's a slightly smaller journal. Geographical trends, we see significantly higher submission rates from Africa and from the Middle East for double-blind review. And the highest number of double-blind submissions were from India at 25%. There's actually quite a high rate, a similar rate for the single-blind site too. The rejection rate is significantly higher for double-blind review. It's about 20% higher than for single-blind, which I think is similar to what Nature have seen. And we've sort of drilled down a bit there and found that we do think we get more lower quality submissions for the double-blind site, judging from the lower distribution of referee scores. So as we've gone through the year, you can see here the total number of double-blind submissions to these journals has steadily increased, and we're now up to about 50 a month. So I guess as word has kind of got round that this is an option. In terms of the author survey, we've had 15 responses so far, and 14 of those authors rated their experience as a really positive one, at least 8 out of 10. And that's slightly more positive, actually, than we see in the single-blind survey. 13 out of the 15 respondents have said they chose the double-blind route because they think it's the fairest system of peer review. I guess that's no great surprise that they're saying that. We've just had 2 responses so far to the referee survey, and they were both quite positive. Neither of the referees were confident of being able to identify the authors, so that's pretty positive, because obviously that's an oft-made criticism of double-blind. We've also looked at the peer review times, and this has surprised us a bit. The times are actually, on average, slightly shorter for the double-blind submissions than for the single-blind submissions. So we've not encountered problems getting referees to accept for double-blind review, which has been really encouraging. So no real significant operational issues for us with this, apart from the occasional author kind of failing to anonymize their manuscript properly. And it's working fine for our journal staff. They're not spending significantly longer on double-blind articles, and they're okay working across the 2 sites. So in conclusion, I think our initial results suggest there is a significant demand from authors for double-blind review in these physics-related areas. The 20% uptake we're seeing so far is well, at least on target. It probably really exceeds our expectations. We think, if anything, this probably underestimates the demand for double-blind review, since it's obviously a voluntary option, and most authors, certainly in these fields, are not normally in the habit of anonymizing their manuscripts, so it's more work for them. So double-blind authors are reporting being highly satisfied with their experience of the process. And it's really, from an operational point of view, having the 2 peer review options is working fine for us. So finally, in terms of next steps, we'll do the final analysis and full report once the pilot has run its 12 months, so that will probably be in January of next year, and then decide whether to retain the double-blind option on these 2 journals, which I think is probably fair to say at this stage is looking likely, and whether to roll it out to other journals published by IOP, which I think is also looking likely. So finally, just to say, this is an area of peer review sort of experimentation that IOP Publishing is very much focused on at the moment. So we're certainly looking to have further kind of innovations, perhaps around open peer review. I'm looking forward to hearing the other talks, actually. Thank you.
Simon, thank you very much indeed. Questions at the back.
Hello, Irene Haynes. Double-blind peer review is getting much harder to actually operate and make it effective because of preprint servers. And obviously in physics, the culture is well established, lots of people submit. So did you actually look at the papers that chose double-blind peer review option? Had they actually been put on a preprint server at all?
No, we didn't. And I think this is a really good point, and it's definitely one of the potential drawbacks with this. What I will say is the journals we've chosen, the subject areas they're in, not very few submissions for these journals go onto the archive. But I agree this could be an issue for some of the more core physics journals where the archive's heavily used. So I think that's something we'll have to have a think about.
Yeah, obviously, if you roll it out to other of your journals, I think it's quite an important consideration.
It is, yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
Rob Sievers, New Zealand. I have peer reviewed over many years articles under the double-blind peer review system, and in about 30–40% of the cases I've been able to identify the authors, either through statements of in a previous study we have shown that, and so on. In your instructions to the authors for the double-blind option, do you ask them to remove any of those comments?
We do, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
It's very much the author's responsibility. We accept that sometimes they're not going to blind their manuscript well enough, but at least, you know, that's 70% of cases where it is done blind. So, yeah.
Rennie, wherever. So, single blind is an ancient tradition that we've established and take on, even though we now require papers to be signed and things. So it's very quaint indeed. So there's single blind. Now you're trying double blind, which quite a few people have done already. And the problems with double blind, it's tedious, it's expensive, it can be broken. And where it's chiefly broken, the double blind is, it's broken wrongly. Now, the big upset that people have against peer review is, or blinding peer review, is that junior people will be beaten around by senior people if they see their names come out, if it's open. And first of all, that's a perfectly disgraceful reason to adopt an unethical system, because an even worse unethical thing would happen. And secondly, it's been shown that most of the time when they guess wrong. Yeah. People say, I know so-and-so did it, and they didn't.
And your question
and
is,
so
Drummond.
At the moment, yes, and my question is, why on earth did you bother to do this study? It seemed to me that you should be doing open peer review. So I'd be really interested, why on earth did you do it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we did it this way because single blind, it might be an ancient tradition, but it's kind of served the physics community quite well. So we wanted to look at double blind and just to trial it in the first instance rather than just mandating double blind. In terms of open review, it's probably something we want to look at. But I think, again, some concerns about that in terms of possibly the rigor of the referee reports if their names are going to go with the papers. So I think that's something that I'm interested in hearing more about, and we will be looking at.
Randomised trials have been done. Over here, thank you.
Stuart Taylor from the Royal Society in London. It's not entirely clear to me what your objective here is, because you seem to just be looking at author preference, which in itself is not really a reason to change what you're doing. And the fact that authors like double-blind peer review, why is that a reason for doing it? Surely you need to look at whether it's more effective or better in some way. I mean, you've said it's associated with slightly worse submissions, so it seems puzzling to me that, you know, I'm not sure what you're trying to do.
Well, I think part of our mission as a publisher is to offer a service to our authors. So if there's a big section of the community who feel that they're not getting a fair service through the ancient traditional system, then we're interested in offering a different option to them. So that was the main aim of the study, is to see whether there is demand and whether it works okay. And it seems the answer to both those points is yes.
Thank you.
Nicola Nugent, Royal Society of Chemistry. Thanks for a nice talk. I'm just going back to the first question from Irene about anonymising manuscripts and how difficult that can be. Did you do any checks on whether the authors did actually anonymise their manuscripts fully in terms of the content and associated files and that sort of thing? And was that something that you were able to measure? And secondly, were you able to measure any impact on the peer review outcomes, which I guess relates to the question previously?
Yeah, so we do kind of screen the manuscripts when they come in, certainly at a high level, to make sure that the authors aren't revealing their names. We didn't go to the extent of reading through the whole paper and seeing whether they inadvertently gave themselves away. In terms of the levels of failing to anonymise the manuscript, it was quite high to begin with, probably approaching 50% right at the start. But then we added an extra point on the submission form just to really drill home to authors that you need to, before you submit, you need to have anonymised your manuscript, and it's now very low levels of, well, quite low levels of failure to anonymise. What was the second point?
Sorry, the second question was just about whether you were able to measure any impact on the peer review outcomes, so whether the paper was accepted or rejected.
No, we haven't done that yet.
3 more brief questions, yeah.
Melissa Vaught, Bethesda, Maryland. One of my concerns here about comparing these differences in rejection rates between double-blind and single-blind peer review is that you may actually be penalizing these authors for opting into double-blind peer review. I mean, there's at least one report that has indicated that reviewers score publications more harshly when they're blinded to the names of those authors. But basically what you're saying here is you're saying these are lower quality publications because the reviewers scored them more poorly. So how do you address that issue to make sure that this isn't just some sort of bias among authors for basically what do these authors have to hide for opting into double blind?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It is possible that referees are demonstrating some kind of bias there. But I think the point was to give the authors the choice. They don't have to submit down the double-blind route. If they do feel that they're going to get a harder deal that way, then they can submit down the single-blind route. So it's all about offering choice, really.
Well, right, but I wonder how many authors are really aware of that sort of bias in the system that might be present in the system, and so that they may not realize that they're actually sort of opting into a more biased route.
Thanks.
Theo Bloom from BMJ, but with a question that's come via Twitter, and for the person categorising questions, that's from Emily F. on Twitter. Why are submissions for double-blind review of lower quality? What's the social context that influences that? I mean, do you have a theory on why, if, taking what Melissa said, they may not be of lower quality, but if they are, why is that happening?
It's hard to say. I guess it may be encouraging submissions from areas that the research isn't quite as developed or doesn't have as much funding. I mean, the data's there to see, and I think you can interpret it however you want, really. I don't want to try and draw conclusions.
Thank you. Final question.
Yeah, I mean, you got some flack for saying we did this because it's service to authors, and, I understand both sides of that argument. But I hope that lots of us in this room really care about the fact that people in low and middle income countries, often doing very good research, do really struggle to get it published. And that's partly because our journals don't have nearly enough reviewers from those countries, and we should all be bending over backwards to try and find the best reviewers in those regions, and then we might help to solve the real problem. That's right, that was a comment.
I think that's a really good point. Yeah.
A comment to end on. Thank you very much, and thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
So next we have Sarah Parks. Sarah.
Hi, my name is Sarah Parks, and I work at RAND Europe, which is a not-for-profit policy research institute in the UK, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the use of open peer review. So before I get started, I want to give a little bit of background to my work and where the data I'm going to talk about kind of comes from. So between January 2016 and March 2017, I was involved in a project for the European Commission to develop a pilot online monitor to track different trends in open science. And for those of you, most of you are aware, but open science is the move towards greater transparency, sharing, and collaboration within the kind of research community. So this was a large collaborative project which involved bringing data that says something about the development of open science together from a wide range of sources into one place. And the wheel shown on the screen shows at a high level what's tracked on the monitor. So we focused on 3 characteristics of open science: open access to publications, open research data, and open scholarly communications. And within these areas, we have specific indicators which show, where possible, the behaviors or practices within the areas, the journal and funder policies, and the attitudes of researchers. And so within open scholarly communications, one of the things we looked at was open peer review. And this is both in terms of the behaviors of researchers and also in terms of journal policies. So this is what I'm going to show you today. As the primary aim of the pilot monitor was to test the feasibility of collecting appropriate data and not really to analyze the data. This is mainly a descriptive talk about the data. Okay, so what is open peer review? I guess many people in the room have quite a good idea about what open peer review is, But what I wanted to highlight is that open peer review is an umbrella term for a large number of non-traditional and more open ways of conducting peer review. So there was a systematic review done earlier this year, which looked at about 120 definitions for open peer review, and 95% of them had one of the top two things on the slide in them. So open identities, which is reviewers revealing their name to authors and vice versa, and open reporting, so reviews being published alongside articles at some point during the process. And we look at these two elements. In the context of monitoring open science, what we wanted to know is what's happening in open peer review. So specifically, what forms of open peer review are being used by journals, but also what do researchers maybe want to do. Do uses of open peer review vary by discipline or in a European context by country? And the big question in open science terms in monitoring is peer review becoming more open? So we used two sources of data for open peer review. So firstly, Publons, which many of you are probably familiar with. It's an online platform which allows reviewers to record their peer reviews and provides a verified record of peer review activity. We obtained two sets of data. So we obtained journal policies on peer reviews. So are authors allowed or required to sign their reviews, and are authors allowed or required to publish the reviews? And then also user data on the data in Publons, how many of the reviews are published openly. So these data allow us to look at kind of a global picture, like the landscape of open peer review, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what researchers would choose to do. So we also obtained data from PeerJ, which is an open access journal that gives reviewers the option to sign their reviews, and it also gives authors the option to publish the review history with the article. So before I get into the data in detail, I want to just list a number of kind of important caveats when interpreting the results. So starting with the Publons data, it's important to note the data aren't necessarily representative for all countries, disciplines, open peer reviews. Kind of by definition, the data are for users of Publons, who are probably not representative of all peer reviewers. Publons estimated at the time that we took this data that had about 1% of the reviews, which done globally, which is a small percentage, but still quite a large number. Publons as a platform is obviously used more in some countries than others, so you have to be careful when you look at the country data, how you interpret it. And the journal insight into the use of open peer review. So let's have a look at some of the data. So starting with the policy data. So we had data on 3,692 journals. Of these, 3.5% allow or require reviewers to sign their reviews, and 2.3% allow or require peer reviews to be published. As you can tell, these are quite small numbers. This graph shows this data by discipline, split into 5 different disciplines. The size of the bubble corresponds to the number of journals, so the bigger the bubble, the more journals we had information on. You can see that in general, more journals allow or require signing than allow or require publishing of reviews. And this is true for all disciplines apart from arts and humanities, which, as you can see, is a very small bubble. So it's the one we kind of have least data on. So that's, I guess, what journals allow, and that obviously affects what users can do. But what does that then look like in terms of use of people on Publons? So this graph shows the percentage of reviews published openly on Publons. That's the blue line. On average, 1.7% of the reviews in Publons are published openly. And as you can see, there's no evidence at the moment that this is going up over time. The red line, so one thing that you can do on Publons as a reviewer is to say, I would like this to be published openly, and then sometimes journals wouldn't allow that, so then it doesn't get published openly. And so that's what the red line is showing. It's important to note these might be the same reviewers who publish openly elsewhere, but these journals then don't allow it. So very briefly, a country level. This map shows the percentage of reviews published openly. We only show countries with more than 100 unique reviewers and Publons. That's kind of a decision that we made. You can see that the percentages range from around 0 to 14 in Saudi Arabia, with most countries come out about 1 to 5%. Obviously, you have to be careful if you want to generalize this data beyond just people on Publons. And what about by discipline? So by discipline, you can see that all the percentages are quite small, so 2% is the highest, and the discipline that came out highest is life sciences. So far I've shown data at like the global level, where often authors and reviewers don't necessarily get to choose the peer review process they go through. But what about in a journal where reviewers and authors get to choose the level of openness? So this graph shows data from PeerJ of the percentage of reviews which authors choose to publish, which is in blue, and the percentage of reviewers that choose to name themselves, which is in red. You can see that the blue line comes out about 70%-ish, and the red line at about 40%. PeerJ was launched in 2013. Its use has been growing over time. It's interesting to see that as this has been happening, there hasn't been an enormous change in the use of its open peer review features. And if anything, use might be slightly decreasing. And it will be interesting to see how this develops over time. So in conclusion, open peer review is obviously something which is happening in different forms, but it still seems to account for a small percentage of reviews carried out worldwide. And in both a global sense and in a local sense, the data we have at the moment doesn't indicate that open peer review is necessarily taking off, although obviously in PeerJ there is quite high uptake of some of the options. So I'd just like to finish by saying a big thank you to Publons and PeerJ for providing the data, and hopefully I will continue to work with them to look at as they now have a lot more data on this.
Thank you, Sarah. Questions? What do you think why do you think this is? Why do you think it's not taking off?
Well, I mean, I guess one of the things is that, so one thing I think would be interesting to look more at is researcher attitudes. So we have the PeerJ data, which shows what happens in a journal where people are given choice. And there was recently a survey that looked at people, most of whom had done some form of open peer review, that showed that many of them think open peer review is the future. So I think it's about whether journals allow people to do it, I think, in some senses.
Thanks.
Chris Papes in Kansas City. I, like many other editors, have the impression, although I've not seen data to support that impression, that it's more difficult to find reviewers today than it was years back. Is there any data regarding open peer review in the form of somebody actually signing a review that indicated it is more difficult? Because I think it would be tremendously more difficult to get people to agree to review under those conditions.
So I don't have any data on that. I think it's a really interesting question, and that's definitely something that you hear a lot anecdotally that people are worried about.
And it's the topic of our next presentation, so we get some data from that. Yep.
So the peer review process can be thought of as a whole series of good faith agreements. The author submits their paper in good faith, the journal acts in good faith to responsibly review the paper, and the reviewers especially are acting in good faith to in some ways provide their intellectual input or intellectual property to the author to improve their paper. So to what degree, if we're going to move to open review, should the reviewers sign off on allowing the author to review and post, and in some case comment critically, publicly on their input?
I think that's a good question. So I don't really know the answers to that, but I think it's interesting that in PeerJ, it is the authors that get to choose whether the reviews are published rather than the reviewers, which is different from, say, the data on Publons, where the reviewers are choosing.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Amy Price from the BMJ and from Oxford University. And I thank you for your beautiful presentation. It's great. I'm all for open peer review. The one thing that I see coming up, though, is sometimes peer reviewers whose names are given in the article are quite viciously attacked on social media, and also editors as well. So I'm wondering if, as a community, you know, at the Peer Review Congress, if there's any way that we could set in place some kind of a strategy to protect the peer reviewers, especially young career researchers where it may affect their later career, and patient reviewers, of course, and also editors from this kind of, you know, nastiness. If there's some kind of, you know, some kind of stand that we could take as to just saying that, you know, that this was unacceptable, or if there could be some repercussions. I'm just throwing it out there so we can think about it, and really appreciate your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Amy. Any thoughts on that? Others may have suggestions. Yeah.
Theo Bloom from BMJ. There's a little minor storm going on Twitter because yesterday Crossref announced providing DOIs for peer review reports in a particular category. And when I posted that, people are saying, but COPE says you have to keep peer reviews confidential. I said, well, I'm coming from this perspective of open peer review where once published, they're not confidential, so people can take credit for them and so on. But there's obviously still a lot of confusion about who has the right to claim, post, or otherwise deal with peer review. I think Chris Graff from COPE is here, and maybe he'd like to comment on why COPE says all reviews have to remain confidential permanently, even if they're published. I mean, we just seem to have some confusion about who can do what with
Thanks,
reviews.
yeah. Calling Chris from COPE. Please do, but I'll just, while you get to the microphone, we'll just take...
Hilda Bastian from PubMed Commons. My question was essentially the same. And thanks, Sarah, for showing that, and it's logical that the people who wanted to share their peer reviews in Publons wanted them to be open and the journal policy wouldn't allow it. I understand what the argument is to justify saying that a journal can say an article is, you know, can't be sort of published if it's a firewall journal, but I don't even understand what the rationale is for why a peer review that you wrote yourself is not, you know, you don't have the copyright for it. And I don't know if anyone can answer that. I mean, I'd actually like to know what the rationale is.
I can give a rationale, but maybe others could too, at the back, and then we'll come to Chris.
Irene Hames. I'll leave Chris to clarify the COPE things because there is confusion on that, and then maybe I'll step in because I drafted the original COPE ethical guidelines for peer reviewers, in which that comment was put, but it is very carefully worded that things are not allowed to be released beyond what the journal allows. And this also speaks to the data because it's not actually the reviewers who are choosing to make them open or not. In the Publons data, in the data, it's the journal publishers and the editors who are choosing that, whatever the reviewer may want to do. So I think we have that conflation. And so I think, you know, if you ask the reviewers what they would actually like to do, because POJ, obviously, the authors have the choice, the reviewers can do it. But I should also say a little bit of a plug for the session at the end of the conference. We're going to be talking in the transparency and peer review session at 5:30. We're going to be actually talking about a lot of these issues.
Thank you. Chris.
Right-ho. Chris Graff, co-chair of COPE. So my understanding of the COPE guidelines is that the guideline, there are multiple parts of the guideline, but the part that refers to confidentiality of peer review actually simply states that the conditions under which the peer review was provided to the journal should be respected by the peer reviewer. It doesn't say that the peer reviewer shall not provide their comments or publish their comments elsewhere. It just says that the peer reviewer should respect the conditions under which those comments were provided to the journal.
Thank you, that's very clear. I don't know if it's a bit mean of me, but if Elizabeth Loder's in the room, you might want to share our difficulties we've had about the peer review comments on papers that aren't accepted and how they might, I mean, in answer to Hilda's point, but just to call out.
Robert Danziger from Chicago. I just, a general comment. The overall sort of thing, writing thing is that the incentive for peer review is primarily to be a good member of the scientific community. And I'm wondering if by using people's names and so forth, you may be able to increase that so that there's some, rational benefit that a peer reviewer gets. It's sort of like Wikipedia. Why do people contribute to Wikipedia? What do they get out of it?
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the reasons, particularly in the survey I mentioned earlier, that people think open peer review is the way forward.
Thank you very much indeed. So the question about acceptance rates for opening other forms of peer review, Maria Kowalczuk.
Hello, thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak at this meeting. My name is Maria Kowalczuk. I'm co-editor-in-chief of Research Integrity and Peer Review, which is published by Biomed Central, and I'm also Research Integrity Manager at Springer Nature. And I have done this research in collaboration with Michelle Samarasinghe, who is a senior data analyst at Nature, which is also now part of Springer Nature. And we analyzed Biomed Central and Springer Open journals, which are now also part of Springer Nature. So that's our declaration of any competing interests. And the sort of rationale stems from the anecdotal evidence from our editors that it is not easy to recruit reviewers, and I think many people in the room will sort of have experienced this as well. And I, as an editor, realized that recruiting reviewers is one of the most time-consuming parts of the manuscript life cycle, and also our journal performs open peer review. So again, that's we have heard from other editors of open peer review journals that it's a difficult task to recruit reviewers. So we were wondering whether there is any way we can look into this. There is a recent study looking into perhaps whether reviewer fatigue is a problem which is contributing to these difficulties, and it was found that actually this isn't a major factor. So the fact that there is an increasing number of journals, an increasing number of submissions that seem to be outpacing the growth of the sort of base of experts who are qualified to review. And so that could be one of the factors, but there are probably, apart from busyness, many other factors that contribute to any individual decision to undertake peer review that the experts are making. So our question was whether the peer review model of the journal is one of such contributing factors. Because quite interestingly, most of the surveys of researchers and reviewers show quite consistently that the double-blind peer review model is pointed out as the most unbiased, as the most fair model. But on the other hand, as we've heard in this session, authors often claim to be able to recognize who reviewed their paper. Reviewers also often are able to identify the authors in the double-blind model, so none of the models is perfect. So we set out to determine whether there is a difference in proportion of reviewers who agree to undertake peer review of manuscripts for journals that use different peer review models within the different subject areas that are covered by our portfolio. So we performed a retrospective analysis of Biomed Central and Springer Open journals, and that was done for the period of time when these journals were handled on one common platform, so all the manuscripts were handled within this one platform. So we were able to generate a report which would provide us with a number of reviewers who accepted an invitation to review or re-review a manuscript. And the limitation of this study is that we were not able to distinguish between whether these invitations were to review, to do the primary review, or to re-review a revised manuscript. And from these numbers, we calculated the proportion of all invited reviewers who accepted an invitation. And we grouped the journals into the 3 models that are used by our portfolio of journals. So the open model, so out of the existing 122 definitions, the one that we use is that the authors know who the reviewers are know who the authors are, and also the reviewer reports, signed reviewer reports, are published alongside the published article. So that's our open model. And the majority of our journals use the traditional single-blind model, where the authors don't know who the reviewers are, but not vice versa. And also we have some journals that use the double-blind model, where both the authors and reviewers are blinded to each other's identity. And we also looked into the 10 main subject areas that are covered by our portfolio as listed here, to see if there are any differences by subject area. And the results are published as Table 15 in the Book of Abstracts. And what I wanted to focus on at this moment is that we analyzed almost 500 journals. And although the majority of them use the single-blind peer review model, we also have quite a few journals that use the open model and the double-blind model. So although there are differences in sizes between these groups, for each of the analyzed group, we were able to analyze thousands of manuscripts and thousands of reviewer invitations. So overall, we were able to look at almost 300,000 manuscripts and almost 1.5 million reviewer invitations. And we have found that in total, about 50% of the invitations were accepted, but there were differences between groups of journals using different peer review models. So about 60% of reviewers accepted the invitations for the journals that operate the double-blind peer review, and 42% journals that use open peer review. So that also translated into the average number of invitations that were sent out per manuscript. So as you can see within this graph, when you look at the accepted invitations, it was on average 2.5 accepted invitation per manuscript for each of the groups, so for every peer review model. But that meant that but the numbers of invitations that were sent out were quite different. So for the journals that use the double-blind peer review model, on average a little bit over 4 invitations were sent per manuscript, and it was closer to 6 for the journals on open model. So there is a clear difference between the numbers of invitations that were sent out. But as you can see, these differences are not that staggering. This wouldn't be a difference that would, cause major issue or break a journal. And we have identified 4 different subject areas within which we have journals that use all the 3 different peer review models. And here, again, for each of the subject area, we found that the highest proportion of reviewers accepted an invitation to review for those journals that use the double-blind model, and the lowest proportion accepted an invitation for a journal that does open peer review. And we also looked into whether the differences are statistically significant, and we found that they were between the models, and also the differences were statistically significant for the open model. So statistically significantly more reviewers accepted an invitation to review to perform open peer review for the clinical medicine journals than, for example, for biomedicine, health sciences, or life sciences. So it seems that perhaps within clinical medicine, open peer review is perhaps a more established model, and reviewers seem to be more comfortable with that. And this is just to show you the matrix of p-values for pairwise comparisons of those proportions of reviewers agreeing. So just to show you that the majority of these comparisons were statistically significant, or the differences were statistically significant, but not all of them. Apart from those 4 subject areas that I mentioned before, for the other 6 subject areas, we only have journals that operate single-blind peer review. So this is what we looked in at the next stage. We compared proportion of reviewers who accepted an invitation to review a manuscript on the single-blind model for the 10 different, our main 10 different subject areas that we cover. And as you can see, the differences here are not very large. For some reason, the highest proportion agreed for the journals within the mathematics field. We are not sure why this is the case. We haven't looked into the detail. But for all the other subject areas, it was between 52 and 60% of reviewers accepting an invitation to review on the single-blind model. So again, we did pairwise comparisons of these proportions, and some of the differences are statistically significant, but not all of them. So just to summarize, for our data set, we found that on average 5 invitations to review were sent per manuscript and 2.5 were accepted, but there were differences between groups of journals operating on different peer review models, so the highest proportion of reviewers agreed to review for the journals that used the double-blind model and the lowest for open peer review. And that meant that on average a little bit under 6 invitations were sent per manuscript on the journals that use the open model, and a little bit over 4 invitations on the journals that use the double-blind model. And the general proportions were similar for different subject areas, and there were statistically significant differences for the open peer review model, where for the clinical medicine journals, a higher proportion of reviewers agreed to do open peer review than for the other fields. And looking into the single-blind model, when we looked at the 10 different subject areas, the highest proportion of reviewers agreed for the journals in the field of mathematics. So just to summarize, going back to the original question, peer review model of the journal is probably, to some extent, a contributing factor to the decision to peer review, but it's not the only one, probably not the decisive one. So perhaps open peer review comes with some challenges, but not insurmountable challenges. And as we've heard in all the discussions this week, no peer review model is perfect, and the decision to on which model to adopt, should be a lot of different considerations should be taken into account, and interest of reviewers could be one of them. Thank you.
Maria, thank you. Questions? Someone heading for the microphone. Oh, leaving the room. Yeah.
Hi, Chris Papazian, Kansas City. I actually look at that difference of having to contact one additional reviewer for an open access, for open peer review as quite significant. If you go through the way my journal works, we contacted a reviewer. If we don't hear anything back, we contact it again. So having to contact one additional reviewer can result in a delay of potentially a week on the initial review, and then on a resubmission, another week. So, this could potentially cost you 2 weeks as far as the overall acceptance duration for that particular manuscript. Which is
so what we have found kind of practically working on these journals, it's that it's a good idea to invite a large number of reviewers to start with. So perhaps if you invite 6 reviewers in the first round of invitations, then you have a fairly good chance of having 2 or 3 agreed. So it sort of pays to put in a little bit more effort initially, and then it should be okay.
Thanks.
Thanks very much. Tahir Pillay, Journal of Clinical Pathology. At this conference, I heard a lot of comments about the merits of open peer review, but what I'm seeing now is that from your study, if you add the double blind and the single blind, it seems that blind reviews is the preferred system for most reviewers. And I think the other question I want to ask is has there been any data comparing the rate of acceptance between blind reviews and open reviews? Because I suspect that it's human nature that if you have an open review, you're more likely to review the paper favorably. So has there been any comparison between the rates of acceptance between a blind review process and an open review process?
So we did a study previously where we compared two different journals, one of which was using single-blind peer review and the other journal was using double-blind. And so the problem with our journals is that we have only one peer review model per journal. So there is no way of checking this within one journal. But when we compared two journals which were in many ways similar but differed by the model, we found that at the end of the day, the rate of acceptance, there was no difference in the rate of acceptance. But of course, these were two different journals within slightly, so there are probably some confounding factors. So I think some further research would need to be done to establish this.
I mean, just to use my chair's prerogative, there have been randomized trials, and I'm aware of two of them having been involved in them, which looked exactly at that, blinded versus open review at the BMJ. And we found that there was a small increase in acceptance rates amongst the open group, but not significantly so. And we felt that because we have an internal editorial team, that didn't impact on the overall acceptance rate. And we found that the reviews themselves were, if anything, slightly more acceptable, in terms of their quality. So it is possible to do randomized trials in this area, and I would encourage anyone who's looking at open peer review to do a randomized trial before they actually introduce it and see that within their own specialty area.
Thank you. I'm Bertti Salahen from the Finnish Medical Journal and the European Journal on Neurology. And I have a comment, because those acceptance rates are, I think, they are extremely high, because in the European Journal of Neurology, the acceptance rate is 29% for invited to review. And another point, in the Finnish Medical Journal, we just moved to double-blind peer review, and we are going to explore what happens also on the quality of the reviews. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, so as I mentioned, a limitation of our study is that we were not able to distinguish between reviewers who accepted the primary review invitation and an invitation to re-review. So perhaps some of the acceptance rate was inflated by the same reviewer being invited again to review the same manuscript after revisions.
Thanks.
Hi, this is Bahar from Elsevier. Maria, I have a question for you. Did you consider looking into, to begin with, was it possible for you to check whether changing the peer review model from one journal, from one model to the other would impact any of the factors that you looked at? And I have also a comment. We have a very small pilot in Elsevier with 5 journals. We switched from single blind to double blind, to open, in the sense that reviewers' comments to authors were published alongside the accepted article. And we looked at the reviewer acceptance and completion rates. The pilot is up and running for 3 years, and we compared the reviewers' acceptance and completion rates before the pilot was live. And now that it is up and running, we couldn't find a significant difference. I could see that, for example, seasonality is making a bigger difference than switching between the models. Thank you.
Yes, so within our portfolio, we had only one journal that changed the peer review model in the time frame that we analyzed. But looking at the data for just a single journal, as you said, it did not give a conclusive answer because the data is quite noisy for one journal. So that's why we thought if we look at large portfolios, we can see a difference. But within one journal, there was no significant difference.
Thanks.
Yep. Hello, Chris. Work at Wiley, volunteer at COPE. A question. What do you think about combining double-blinded peer review with open peer review? Sounds like a contradiction in terms, right? But I could imagine blinding the peer review part of it and then opening it up at the end once it's all happened. So I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, I think it's a very interesting thought, and it's definitely worth trying out. So I know that one of our journals, Nature Communications, is offering the authors a choice of single-blind, double-blind, or transparent peer review where the reports are published. So I'm waiting for them to sort of complete the pilot and see what the outcome would be. And I think it's very worthwhile to try out and pilot different approaches, such as the one you mentioned. So I would encourage editors who would be interested in this sort of research to undertake it, because I think it's definitely worthwhile trialing different options and combinations.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Maria.
Thank you.
And finally, a novel approach to open peer review, Scott Kobner.
Hello everyone, my name is Scott Kobner, and it's an honor to be here presenting the work that my colleagues Derek, Michelle, and I have been putting together over the past several months. Today I'll be discussing a novel publication format for open peer review commentary and its observed effects on an emergency medicine blog that I work for. So to begin with some background, Academic Life in Emergency Medicine, or ALIEM, is one of the premier free open access medical education blogs that exist to date. In the last year, we reported about 1 million views alone. In 2014, ALIEM was the first open access medical education online resource to deploy its own open peer review process in order to enhance the scholarly value and rigor of the work that was published to our site from submitted contributors. And this model of open peer review publication, which I'll refer to for the rest of this talk as our traditional model, consisted of an attributed expert peer review commentary being addended to the bottom of post content with full access for readers upon post publication. After about 114 posts published in this manner, we saw a potential untapped pedagogical value in revisiting how this peer review content was published for our viewership. And because a blog is not beholden to the limitations of a traditional print publication, we sought to devise a unique method of publishing our reviewers' commentary that fully utilized our publication's medium. And we call this method inline. I have a quick video to display a simple bit of the custom HTML and CSS styling that goes into displaying this reviewer commentary throughout the body of our post content, hopefully engaging readers with hover over functionality. The video demonstrates it in action, and you can see at the bottom of each post, we still publish the full-length reviewer commentary so that reviewers can expound upon the short inline form comments that they intertwine throughout the article. We base this innovation off of an educational theory known as Meyer's cognitive theory of multimedia learning, which led us to the following 2 hypotheses for our study. All right. First, we believed that the inline would encourage readers to spend time actually reading this published peer review commentary. Thus, we expected readers to spend more time on pages that featured this inline format. And secondly, we reasoned that inline would actually engage our readers to interact with our peer review content, increasing the likelihood that they would click on this content, as well as increasing their interaction with parts of the web page that featured the commentary, which we were able to measure using an analysis of scrolling down the page. So to test these hypotheses, we developed a prospective randomized ABN split test trial, which is a standard experimental methodology in web design and development. First, we selected a representative post from our new submissions queue and recruited 2 peer reviewers to generate 3 versions of the same post content. One featuring our inline formatting, one using the traditional open peer review formatting that we've already employed, and finally a control post which did not feature any expert peer review content. Over the next 30 days, we randomized all visitors to our website to view one of these 3 post versions in a 1-to-1-to-1 allocation ratio by using a custom Google Analytics experiment. We then recorded analytics data using an array of industry standard analytics tools shown below. We then repeated this process for another post and combined our data into the following 3 categories. Overall, 2,365 web visitors from 894 cities across 84 countries participated in this study. There was no statistically significant demographic differences between groups after randomization, and bounce rates between groups across all 3 web pages were not significantly different. So in order to study the time users spent on each blog post, we adopted a measure known as active time, and I think this warrants a little bit of explanation. Essentially, every 5 seconds, users' computers would notify our servers if a user had met 2 conditions. One, if they either clicked or scrolled on the content on our webpage in those previous 5-second interval, and if the tab of our content was the active tab in the user's browser at that time. If these conditions were not met, our servers would fail to receive a notification during the next 5-second interval, and the user was considered idle, no longer interacting with the content on our page. From this data, we performed a Kaplan-Meier survival analysis and found no statistically significant difference between the 3 groups of our study. Median time spent on each page for control, traditional, and inline groups were 50, 50, and 45-second intervals, respectively. As one measure of interactivity, we analyzed users' clicks on pages featuring inline and traditional commentary formats, as our control page lacked any expert peer review content which users could interact with. On the left side of the slide, you can see a heat map of all the click impressions of the peer review commentary boxes from the 2 sets of posts that featured this content. And as you can see, we found a statistically significant increase in the number of clicks placed on peer review content compared to all other clicks on the page on blog posts featuring inline. Finally, we measured user scroll activity along the length of the web page. I like to call this the millennial Western blot. Each column on this slide is a screenshot of the actual web page displayed to our study participants. You can imagine it as one continuous print scrolling down the web page. Our analytics software tracked every user's scroll activity along the page, and whenever a user stopped scrolling, it captured the area of the website they were viewing. These columns represent summative heat maps for all scrolling activity during our experiment. Areas that are white to red represent areas that users stopped scrolling more frequently, and darker areas represent content that was more frequently scrolled past or never scrolled to at all. Like a Western blot, I can really only interpret this data qualitatively, but I'll argue that there are 2 trends. First, you can see that the web pages with inline saw more activity over text content compared to the traditional and control pages. And secondly, as most clearly demonstrated in the second set of posts, inline appears to increase the depth that users scroll where our summative peer review content was historically located. So in accordance with our findings, we believe that inline does not appear to increase the amount of active time users spend on blog posts when compared to the traditional format of peer review content that we display, or no peer review content at all. However, inline may improve the visibility of this peer review content as users appear to click and scroll on this content more frequently on posts featuring our inline publication format. Of course, these conclusions are with limitations. One major limitation of our study was that we measured active time in increments of 5 seconds. There may, in fact, be a difference between the reading times that users spend on our traditional inline and control posts, but given the actual amount of content and the number of words differing between these posts and the average reading time of our audience, it probably would be hard to detect looking back. Additionally, we offered direct URLs to our posts because they have to be published somewhere online for our visitors to access them. So it's theoretically possible that these URLs could be directly accessed bypassing our randomization, although there's no evidence to believe that occurred to a significant degree in our study. But it's an important theoretical consideration for people looking to replicate this methodology or improve upon it. And finally, our results are likely not super generalizable given that we studied a very limited quantity and variety of blog posts on a very specific emergency medicine blog. For future studies, we would like to try to get more qualitative impressions about readers' interactions with the inline format, as well as more measures of cognitive load that would enable us to understand how this publication format actually interacts with users while they're reading the content that they came to the blog to read. And finally, we hope to take some kind of measure of reader comprehension in our ultimate goal of these studies to see if we can actually improve the way people learn by using peer review commentary in this way. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Questions? Trish.
Hi, Trish Groves from the BMJ. I just wanted to say thank you. I have never seen such tweetable slides. They're amazing. They're really amazing. As you're probably aware, there's a huge fight going on out there about whether or not conferences should be live tweeted and whether slides should be photographed. And I assume that's your intention. If it's not, it's too late because they're out there. And this is great because you've got the limitations, so thanks.
Thank you very much.
So thank you for, this is Vivian Bachelet from Chile. Thank you for sharing negative results. I did find listening to you a bit spooky though. It's as if it's like not Big Brother, but Big Doctor looking on, you know, and seeing what we're doing when we're surfing on the web. I think you have a lot of analytical power there, and I wonder what, you're an MD, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so just, it really freaks me out to know, to think what those who actually devote themselves to this are doing, you know, and knowing how our behavior is on the web.
Yeah, I think
and there's also some ethical stuff, you know, that comes to mind, but I don't know if you can comment.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that was one of the main impetus for us to run this study through the UCSF IRB. And we did a lot of research on a lot of the analytics ethics that exist for corporations like Google, which actually has an incredibly robust code of conduct policy for Google Analytics and actually limits the amount of individual user data that you're actually able to even capture. So most of the data such as demographic information and location based information is much more collected in aggregate. And it does raise a lot of very important ethical questions, I think, moving forward with future studies into the level of data that we're able to obtain and the amount that users are aware of it. For our website and many others, as you might have this notification in your browser that comes up asking you to accept cookies that are in place. Most people just like blindly ignore it or probably don't know what that means. But pretty much every major website and software application in the world today is using that to track similar data, and probably, like you mentioned, have a very cursory understanding of the depth that we could go with analytics, and in some ways I hope to keep it that way because it is very kind of big brotherish, as you mentioned. But it's important to understand and to be aware of.
Joe John, South Carolina Medical Association. Thank you very much. E-medicine has always been kind of at the cutting edge. Two quick questions. What does what you do have to do with emergency medicine in the people who interacted with your blog? And two, since you can time how long the reader may be scrolling, can you give us an idea of how long it took for reviews to get done? Since you could possibly even time them as well.
Yeah, great questions. So what I do in emergency medicine, our website, all the content is basically either divided into major categories revolving around the clinical practice, medical education, and reviews of emergency medicine research, essentially. So that's kind of the emergency medicine aspect of the post that we publish. As far as the review time, that's something we also want to really look into in future studies to see if the reviewer impressions essentially of an inline publication format, how long it takes them to actually put together this method of coming up with these reviews. Just anecdotally, I think it's probably faster and easier for reviewers in the sense that I think everyone in academics is very accustomed to tracking changes in a Word document at some point, whether editing their own manuscripts or a mentee's manuscript. And the process we use is very similar to that, employing Google Docs to handle most of that work. But yeah, it would be great to get data on that.
Thanks. David Schreiger, UCLA Emergency Medicine. Very nice study. Have you considered a format where instead of using a peer review of the secondary literature, which is essentially what you've studied, that your blog post consists of comments laid onto the primary literature, so that what the reader would be seeing would be the original paper for those that are in open access, followed by the blog essentially inserted into that to see if that format would work?
Yeah, I think that would be an incredible study and definitely the next direction forward. Just given the submissions that were available to us on Alium's website, getting that primary literature to the review was just not possible. But I would definitely love to see that as well.
Thank you.
Hello, Christine Rasmussen from the Nordic Cochrane Center. I was wondering about the pedagogical aspect of it, and kind of inspired by looking around this room. Your presentation is competing with a lot of laptops and smartphones and things like that. Were you sort of also investigating whether or not it increased sort of attention on the topics, or were you more trying to sort of, just figure out what people were hovering?
Yeah. So initially we started from the place of studying, just given the feedback we had on our published peer review content and the kind of Twitter storms that sometimes ensued based on some of our reviewers' commentary, that there was a lot of education going on in that discussion that otherwise was going to be buried in an addendum published online somewhere that many viewers would never even access. And so in studying the pedagogical aspect, we thought that by juxtaposing these reviewer commentaries within the body of the post, we'd actually be able to start perking the reader's own thoughts about these issues and maybe start generating their own ideas about some problems with the information that's presented or future directions. Unfortunately, in our study, we weren't ever really able to capture that. We wanted to just see in this pilot if it was something that was even feasible for our blog. But in future studies, the cognitive load aspect that I talk about would be the first step in that assessment to see if having all these links scattered throughout the text of an article and so much other content to hover over is going to overload users' ability to even embrace the original author's content, or if it's going to help reduce that load overall.
Denise Goodman from Chicago. A follow-on to your comments. This kind of whizzed by, so apologies if I got the information wrong, but I thought you mentioned that the time on each page was 50-some seconds, and so that's way less time than most people spend reading a medical article. And so can you comment a little on the implications of that for the consumption of the medical literature if people in blogs or web-accessed material are spending such little time reading it?
Yeah, definitely. I think that overall, the length of a blog post and the style that a blog post is written for is very different. Our average post for submissions anywhere range between 500 to 1,500 words, which is significantly shorter than some of the longer, like 14-page articles in like primary literature. I also think that the F-style formatting that we utilize for online publications kind of enables readers to jump to areas of the article that might be of more value or interest. So for instance, one of the blog posts that was presented was from our Trick of the Trade series, which really helps to translate clinical expertise from more senior clinicians to newer clinicians. And in that post, potentially you might only need to access the one part about how to perform a certain procedure. In fact, we might only be capturing some people who are re-referencing that post just for that one learning point. So I definitely think it shows that blogs have a potential to translate knowledge in a different way, and the length of the overall publication definitely contributes to a shorter reading time, but I'm not sure what implications it has for these readers who are then consuming other sources of medical literature and their reading habits on those sources as well.
Thank you.
Hal Sox from Pecori. As I looked at your Millennial Western blog, I really thought, here's a diagnostic test, and the intensity of the red is sort of the index test. But then the question is, what's the gold standard? What's the outcome? To what degree does the intensity of time spent reflect either great material or stuff you really having trouble understanding? So what's the next step?
Yeah, so I think the gold standard for looking at how users interact with either text-based content or multimedia content would probably be like eye tracking studies, where you can actually, obviously it's a lot more intensive than just putting something out online, where we can actually visualize what users are looking at, the amount of time that they're spending, and then following it up with some measure of comprehension or qualitative measure of impression to understand if those were areas they were having trouble understanding or if they were more intensely focused for another reason.
Thank you.
Last question, thanks.
Hi, Laura Oldock from Baltimore. And I had, I guess, a similar question. I wonder, you concluded that the time bin was too long, and I wonder how you differentiated between idle users and readers who were reading intently.
So the process of determining active time was measured in those 5-second intervals, and there was also, it's like a little bit more complicated than that. There's a 30-second idle period in our methodology that enables, if you haven't triggered either a scroll or a click in 30 seconds, you're given this 30-second grace window of you're just reading this part of the article, and then it could pick up again. So it'll resume your active time on the page.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So, Scott, I think there's huge potential for not just what you're doing on your blog, but also using this methodology for advancing the whole field of peer review research. So I'm sure you'll be inundated with offers of collaboration, and I look forward to seeing you in 4 years' time with a whole load more data. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. That's it for the session. Enjoy your coffee. Well done, guys. Well done. Thank you.